In 1864, the Paiutes were facing another starvation winter as the white invasion increasingly appropriated their traditional food sources. They decided on an appeal to charity, and Sarah and her family came up to Virginia City in 1864 and paraded through the streets to make an appeal to the citizens of Virginia City. What would Virginia City have been like then?
In 1859, there was a major gold find here on the side of Sun Mountain in a camp that later became known as Virginia City. By 1864, the mines had gone deep underground. There had been the development of a major industrial infrastructure up here, mines, mills, shaft houses, huge workforce running 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day, 364 days a year. It was a 24-hour town. There were bars and saloons and entertainments and hotels and every sort of accoutrement of a major city.
The Paiute presentation at the music hall took the form of the tableau vivant, which was a popular 19th century dramatic form, plotless, in which scenes were just presented. And the scenes the Paiutes showed included a coyote dance, a scalp dance, a war council taking a scalp. And Sarah translated her father's speech asking for relief. It would have taken a good deal of boldness to come in and make this appeal.
How did Sarah and her father do as far as raising funds in Virginia City?
They didn't raise nearly enough. They took their show to San Francisco briefly, where it was not very well received, and they had to return to their usual haunts at Pyramid Lake without very much to show for their effort.
Sarah's trail leads us next some 200 miles northeast to the upper border of Nevada, where remnants of the old military fort still stand on what today is the Fort McDermitt Paiute Shoshone Reservation. An historical marker bears testament to Sarah's impact here.
In 1868, at the request of the Army, Sarah and her brother Natchez rode to Camp McDermitt from Pyramid Lake. Soon Sarah became an interpreter at McDermitt, her first paid position for the government. In Sarah's day, there was a good deal more here. It was laid out like other Army posts of the period, a rectangular parade ground, officers' quarters of stone and adobe on one side, men's quarters of stone with earthen floors on the other. Camp C.F. Smith, over the Oregon border, was discontinued. Sarah arranged for the transfer of Paiutes to McDermitt.
There were now 900 in all at Camp McDermitt. Each woman came to me every day with her basket and a number on a tag fastened to a leather thong tied around her neck, and told the size of her family and took what she needed from me. Everyone had enough. Can you wonder, dear reader, that I like to have my people taken care of by the Army? It is said that I am working in the interest of the Army. It is not so, but they know more about Indians than any citizens do and are always friendly.
To the people who were stationed here, McDermitt seemed like a joyless and forbidding sort of place, in the words of one Army wife. But Sarah did a good deal to liven things up. She was the belle of the ball in those days, and after dress parade, she used to mount her horse and, wearing black velvet with red streamers flying from her hat and her gloves, ride through the parade ground to the cheers of the men. Sarah was a renowned rider, both for displays of this kind and also for the hard riding that she later did for the government during the Bannock War, most notably her epic ride to rescue her father's band from the camp of the hostiles at Steens Mountain. After she had done this and came to visit her father, he praised her to his people, and he said, "None is worthy of being chief but her."
76 miles south of McDermitt, the fledgling town of Winnemucca, named after Sarah's father, had established a depot on the Transcontinental Railroad. Here Sarah would embark on trips east to Boston and Washington, D.C., or west to California. On the Bridge Street of today, we can step back in time to the Bridge Street of her day.
Sarah was a familiar figure in Winnemucca. In fact, she lived for a time in the sagebrush encampment back of the old Winnemucca courthouse. In 1875, Winnemucca was a pretty tough town. One traveler described it as a den of thugs or a bedlam of drunken cowboys, sheep herders, miners, and prospectors. And it was probably one of these roughs that assaulted Sarah. She defended herself. She cut a serious gash in his face, and she was jailed, but our guest was not even prosecuted for assaulting Sarah. If that's not racism, I don't know what is. The courthouse that Sarah would have been walking into in 1875 was very different, an older structure that stood in the same spot. And Sarah's feelings would have been very different too, because she was facing a very serious trial. Racism was a problem that many Indians of Sarah's day contended with. And being as proud and sensitive as she was very aware of it. The phrase frequently occurs in her book, "They treated me beautifully." But this was not always the case. There were times when white people would not touch her hand because they considered her a dirty Indian. And worst of all, when she was on a mission for the Army during the Bannock War, at a stage stop, the woman disliked serving her and suggested to the Army officer that accompanied Sarah that her arms and legs should be tied to different horses who would gallop away and pull her apart. The Indians were extremely worried. What would happen to Sarah in the white man's courts? A large crowd assembled in front of the old courthouse. Despite the racism of the day, Sarah had achieved enough standing that she had supporters in the community. Sarah had a fine attorney, Mac Bonifield, who assembled a sterling array of witnesses on her behalf, and the case against Sarah was dismissed. The waiting crowd outside was very happy to hear this news, and the penknife with which Sarah had stopped our gas was regarded as an object of such great public interest that it was offered for exhibition at the American Centennial.
In the same year, Sarah's footprints led to Carson City, where the legislature was meeting.
Back then, there was essentially a lone building, our state capitol, two small wings. This was really a desolate location. They hadn't even done any landscaping at the time, but she had to come here to meet with the state legislature. Her concern was the military was looking, or at least the federal government, to close the base. And if they did that, the Paiutes, northern Paiutes, felt that they were going to be at risk, that the white settlers would possibly massacre them.
She hoped that she'd be able to testify to the legislature, not only for the continuation of Camp McDermitt, but also for the government to provide things that the Paiutes needed, seed grain, farming implements, instruction in farming, so they could help themselves if they no longer had the rations at Camp McDermitt to depend on.
What's interesting in this dynamic in 1875 is the Carson City Appeal, one of the local newspapers, editorialized that the legislature should give Sarah Winnemucca an audience. But this legislature, this all-male legislature, did not, we have by no record of her getting an audience. The legislation itself died, the resolution in the legislature. She never got to express the Paiute voice.
Despite this setback in 1875, Sarah still came back. That was one of the wonderful things about Sarah. When there was a crisis and she was needed, she was there. She never gave up.
And 9 years later, when she arrived to take care of the concerns that were here, people knew who Sarah Winnemucca was. Her stature had gone up very high.
Oh, yes, yes. She'd written her book.
She'd
barnstormed the East. She'd testified in Congress.